Welcome back to the channel, everybody, and today it's my number 8 team in my 2025 NFL Deep Dive Series, the Detroit Lions. Subscribe, like, wow. I did not expect them to come in outside the top 5, and to be honest, they weren't. When Frank Ragnow was there, that was a significant loss for him to retire after the draft. Now their offensive line is depleted of 2 of its starters from last year in Kevin Zeitler and Frank Ragnow. So significant downgrades there have really dragged down what was once the best offensive line in the league to not that at all. We'll get to that. What is that going to do for Jared Goff, who, when kept clean, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, but when pressured is one of the worst. So how will this impact everything? They had some of the most egregious draft picks, I think, of anybody, but it was the most on brand with Dan Campbell in Detroit with Isaac Tesla in the 3rd round, which was just mind-boggling. I don't know that they were probably the only team that had a day 2 grade on him. On the defensive side, man, Aidan Hutchinson, when you see his numbers, when I put them up, keep in mind, he did that in like 5 games or something, 5 or 6 games before breaking his leg. He was on pace for an all-time season. Now, how he bounces back from that injury is still obviously very much up in the air, and we'll see what kind of resolve Aidan Hutchinson has to be able to recover from that kind of an injury, because that's an injury that you think about, man. You can't just break your leg, you know? You can't just break your leg and then be like, oh, I'm just going to run fast. There's a huge mental hurdle there. The biggest hurdle I think this organization is going to have is that they've fallen into what the Philadelphia Eagles did a couple of years ago, where they lost both coordinators to head coaching opportunities. We saw Jonathan Gannon and Shane Steichen go away from the Philadelphia Eagles after their Super Bowl appearance. Now, Detroit is in the same shoes. They lost Ben Johnson. They lost Aaron Glenn. And now they have to replace those guys with a very talented roster. They have to try and get some continuity in here. But it all really starts with the culture building here, which they've done a great job at. Great culture building by Dan Campbell, the head coach. Though he is the 6th ranked head coach that I have, it's the coordinators. It's reshuffling that offense and defensive coordinator all in one move. That's a tremendous concern for what this team can do and how they can truly run it back. Because I'm looking at John Morton and Kelvin Sheppard, and I'm going, okay, John Morton with trying to do what Ben Johnson did so well, which is, be creative and unlock all these different idiosyncrasies. They were the type of team last year where they just piled it on. They're running halfback passes inside the 5-yard line when they're up like 20. They were a team that you force the defense to any point in time, they're going to be doing literally anything. So that's what made them unique. That's what really made them unstoppable. That's what hit a lot of the weaknesses that we saw, especially in the quarterback. So now with John Morton, how is he going to be inventive in that way? Is he inventive in that way? So it's difficult for me to rank him all that high, even though he's coming in with such a plethora of talent that it's almost impossible to screw it up. I do wonder what the ceiling looks like there, because Dan Campbell is very much a CEO head coach. He's not like this guy who's gonna call the plays. He's gonna come up with an offensive strategy, even though he would be classified as an offensive guy. He's very much more about the culture, and that's why he gets the 6th ranking, because he had so little to work with coming to Detroit, and he did so well, and he built up 2 star coordinators in the head coaching cycle. So that's why when you bring in Kelvin Sheppard, who there is some continuity there because he was on Aaron Glenn's staff, so it was an in-house promotion. But when I think of Kelvin Sheppard and I go, okay, he's getting thrust into a situation now where this is a significant upgrade on what he just was prior. Now, from being a linebackers coach, we'll get to those linebackers, he did a fantastic job with Malcolm Rodriguez, with Jack Campbell, with Alex Anzalone. He did such a wonderful job that this hire made sense. Now, again, it's very difficult for a first-time defensive coordinator to come in, get a high ranking, especially when he does have significant work to do, because he can't just come in and try and be Aaron Glenn, but he needs to utilize a lot of what Aaron Glenn did on the defensive side of the ball. Because what Aaron Glenn did do very well is, much like Ben Johnson, he hit a lot of the deficiencies in individual talents. He schemed up things really well. He understood situational football. And now Kelvin Sheppard has to take that over. Because, and the other thing about Detroit's defense is, yes, they have some immense talent in certain levels of their defense, particularly at the safety position and linebacker position. And then they have Aidan Hutchinson coming back from injury. But everyone else is sort of like this situational guy who gets rotated in and has to, be matchup friendly. Can Kelvin Sheppard come up with that? And there's not this great experienced defensive mind that's sort of sitting there within his staff the way that John Morton has with guys like Fraley and Mark Brunell, who can do a lot of the grunt work, who there's enough continuity there on that offensive staff that John Morton should be able to just drop in. But this does hurt what I feel the overall team can do. It does kind of lower the ceiling slightly, even though you're going to see that the talent is so immense that it almost can't be denied. John Morton's got a world of talent to work with. Some of the best running backs, some of the best weapons. He's got it all. Kelvin Sheppard has a lot more work he needs to do. In particular, figuring out the defensive line rotation, figuring out the cornerback situation, developing Terry and Arnold. You lost Ennis Rakestraw to an injury here in the preseason process. Can he get Kirby Joseph to run it back? Because the other thing that you're moving from a defensive coordinator that was a former defensive back, where naturally you would feel like the defensive backs would thrive under a defensive coordinator that was a defensive back mind. So how does Kelvin Sheppard continue that continuity and keep Kirby Joseph and Brian Branch and all that on the upward trajectory that they were on last year, where they just dominated on the back end? Can Kelvin Sheppard maintain that? Or is it a situation where they are going to see a drop-off and maybe the linebackers see an improvement as well? And that how does that balance it out? You hope that it can balance it out maybe in run defense, but in pass defense, that may leave you a little bit more vulnerable, the way that we've seen Detroit vulnerable quite a bit, even with Aaron Glenn. So the big task of Dan Campbell is to not allow this to be a detriment the way that it was to the Philadelphia Eagles, where Nick Sirianni kind of came in, he did some in-house hiring for the offense and defensive coordinator jobs, and it all kind of just collapsed and fell apart, right? After losing Gannon and losing Steichen. And then he just had to reshuffle the deck, and it did turn things around pretty quickly. They win a Super Bowl with Kellen Moore and with Fangio and all that. So it's a test for Dan Campbell. It's not something where if this all kind of falls apart, like his job is on the line by any means or anything like that. I think the organization has a pretty steady mindset when it comes to what Dan Campbell wants to do with this team and how he can continue pushing this team forward. I think that he's done more than enough to build up the trust in the organization as well to make all this work. So I think, and there's also like these worst case scenarios where John Morton doesn't work out. They do have Mark Brunell there, who I'm frankly surprised he wasn't the one that was elevated. I think it's a little bit stickier on the defensive side of the ball, where it may become we got to hire out of house type of thing if Kelvin Sheppard kind of collapses, because there's not really anyone sort of waiting in the wings there, and maybe it's much more likely that it makes more sense to maybe change the defensive philosophy altogether if it doesn't work out, and get away from the Aaron Glenn thing and try to do something new the way that we saw the Philadelphia Eagles do it. So there's at least a blueprint here for longer-term success, even if there's a short-term setback. So I'm confident that this is not going to be that significant of a deal that it's going to completely ruin what the Detroit Lions and Dan Campbell have been building over the last couple of years. Taking a pause from this video to get an ad break in here is what I would say if I had ads, but I don't. So if you could subscribe, if you haven't already, and hit the thumbs up to push out to more people who they might also subscribe. Lead by example. Just lead by example, guys. Back to the roster. A big wild card in all this is Jared Goff, who comes in, gets an 88 grade for me. He's just sitting outside the top 10. Losing Ben Johnson does kind of nerf him a little bit in my book. Losing some of the offensive linemen that they lost in Zeitler and Ragnow does kind of nerf what I think he can produce. And that's really just because of how poor Jared Goff is when he's under pressure. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league when he's pressured. When he's kept clean, he's one of the best. He's one of the best play-action quarterbacks in the entire league. He really, last year, kind of had a downturn in what I would call his big-time throws to turnover-worthy plays ratio. It wasn't as great as you would expect from Jared Goff since he's really excelled here in this Detroit offense. I think from a deep ball and intermediate perspective, he was doing a great job pushing the ball down the field when he had great protection. When he was pressured, that's when you saw a lot of the turnover-worthy plays start to show up. That's where you started to see a lot of the inaccuracies down the field. And in the check down areas, just not very accurate when under pressure either. That's a huge concern. Now, when they were picking up the blitzes, Jared Goff was, again, just absolutely phenomenal. One of the best in the entire league. So he really benefited from having a great offensive line in front of him. He was able to navigate the defense. He understood the pre-snap checks and all that. So how he does that now with just a lesser talented, lesser experienced offensive line for the most part, arguably, you got a left tackle who could be regressing a little bit. Brand new center, so you got to get on the same page with him. To a degree, Glasgow's been around, but, Ragnow's been the center for this team. So there is a little bit of a shift there in what you're going to have to expect and the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes and making that relationship work the way that it was over the last couple of seasons. With that said, you keep Jared Goff clean, he's going to rip you completely to shreds. He's going to hit you at every level of the field, on every side of the field, down outside the numbers, inside the numbers, up the hashes, inside the hashes, right down the middle of the field, 20 yards down the field. He's going to be able to step up into that pocket. He's got a great pocket presence to be able to navigate through that. The interior defensive line that he faces is generally the key in how you stop Jared Goff, is you collapse the pocket from the interior. Because he's not like some phenomenal super athlete who's going to break a pocket and come out with a big run. He's athletic enough that he can take off every now and then, but his goal ultimately is to be a pocket passer and to operate from that area. And I think with the development of a lot of the players that he's had in his weapons room and having a deep running back room and having a really great tight end, it allows him to utilize his skill set completely, because you have Amon-Ra St. Brown who can operate from the slot into those intermediate areas. You have Jameson Williams who can blow the top off of defense. You have Sam Laporta who can operate in the intermediate to deep to short areas, right up the middle in between the hashes the way a great tight end can. And then you have Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery who can utilize the screen game with, check down game with. A lot of safety blankets available to keep him pushing, because he is the quarterback who did have the, quote, perfect game. He did that with great receiver play. He did that with great offensive line play. And he did that with great play calling. Two of those things may not be necessarily there the way that he's used to. Him building chemistry with his offensive coordinator, John Morton, the way he had it with Ben Johnson, is imperative to him coming up with the type of performance that's going to get this team to the Super Bowl, because they probably should have played in one when they lost to San Francisco 2 years ago. They had that game, they had it, and then it was just sort of that collapse that happened because they were able to get pressure on Goff. He wasn't able to step up into the pockets the way that he was comfortable doing, and it all kind of fell apart, on both sides of the ball because of that. There is a huge, huge pressure now on this new offensive line to account for keeping Jared Goff clean. Because if you can't do that, then you're in a situation now where you have to leave running backs in the backfield. So now you're not completely utilizing Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs the way that you want to. Maybe you're sitting in max protection, which means you're not executing Sam Laporta the way you want to. So you need to be able to spread this game out. You need to be able to be creative with Jared Goff so he can utilize the play action game. He can create extra time for himself in that sense. And he can find the open guys down the field. You need offensive linemen who are smart enough to understand the pre-snap checks. You know, the receivers, the chemistry there, it's going to be there the way that it was, because it's a lot of same that he had the last 2 years or so. But getting an offensive line that can understand his checks, understand what he wants, where he wants to step up, the way that Ragnow and Zeitler and all them had that down to a complete science. That's going to be the way that Jared Goff is going to get back to that top 10 quarterback play on a consistent basis. I'm worried that he's going to fall closer to like that 15th, 16th overall quarterback just because he's going to be under pressure a lot more than what he was used to the last couple of seasons. Luckily, he's rolling out with the best weapons group in the entire NFL. It's just one beast after another out here. You can just look at the numbers, look at the grades that they get out here. It's virtually undeniable how great this group is. It starts with Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is one of the best pure slot receivers in the league. Now, he did almost take 50% of his snaps from the outside last year. A lot of that was just, motioning out, trying to maneuver the defense around, identify zone man, all that kind of stuff. But he operates best in the slot. He only had one drop last year. There's the less than 1% drop rate. There's the 20 contested catches completed for a 60 or 67% contested catch rate. That is unreal for a guy that his size. He's not necessarily this giant player. But he lives in this ability to play so physical, and that's what makes him a great slot receiver. He's able to come off of these linebackers, get into those tight spaces with safeties collapsing on top of him, on top of his routes when he's sitting there in some of those middle to hook zones. And his ability to run those deep crossers and to run those deep double moves, and the intermediate levels to do the same, and the short areas to do the same. Even in the screen game behind the line of scrimmage, executes that incredibly well. Has a great catch to target ratio. His run after catch you're a little bit more concerned about, but that's because he lives so much in the physical aspect of the game. I think a lot more than people give him credit for. 12 touchdowns, over 1,250 yards. A lot of that is just him getting open, catching the ball, and being a secure tackler in those tight areas and letting Jared Goff sort of whip that ball around for him. There's a concern about him having to kick out and be an outside wide receiver maybe a little too often. I think that's why they go and they draft the guys that they do, but also that's why you have a guy like Jameson Williams who is this pure outside wide receiving threat. Again, you kick inside a bit on those plays where Amon-Ra St. Brown sort of motioning out, and it turns Jameson Williams into like a slot guy by default. But he's another guy pretty sure-handed. Not a great contested catch guy. He's very, he's like that skinny, lanky, long arm type wide receiver. But a big play threat. 58 catches only, but over 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. 490 yards after the catch. He operated at a really high level. This is the type of player that they wanted him to be when they drafted him. As high as they did when they made the trade that they did with Minnesota to get up to go get him. Even as like a quick, motioning guy in the short drag route, short slants, the quick game, he executes that pretty well. He gets separation really quickly. Even at the intermediate level, that's where he really operates the best. But blowing the top off a defense for those deep routes, that's what Jameson Williams brings to this team. And that ability to mix and match him with Amon-Ra St. Brown, two completely different styles, it opens up the offense for the play caller. And I think that's something that's going to really benefit John Morton, is that he's going to be able to utilize these different talents the way that Ben Johnson was able to. Like such a variety of guys here, with St. Brown being able to work the slot for most of the time. Jameson Williams being the outside threat that really drags those safeties away. That then's going to open up opportunities for so many other guys in this offense, like Tim Patrick, who's this veteran presence. But then they have Khalif Raymond, who's like this fun, he's mostly a special teams guy, but he's like this fun gadget type player you can utilize on the offense. They did draft Isaac Tesla in the 3rd round, which is probably the most Dan Campbell draft pick that they've done, from this last draft, where it's like they're the only team that had a second-day grade on Tesla. I didn't even know anything about this guy until they picked him. I was kind of like rolling my eyes at it, and I don't particularly see anything special about him. They must see something special about Tesla in order to, do what they did here, which is use a high-level draft pick on him. So they definitely have plans for him. I just don't see how he makes the field with all these other weapons that they have out there right now. And they have Dominic Leavitt, who I think is as equal as it gets to Tesla, to be honest. So it was an interesting decision. I don't know how exactly that's going to work out for them. But adding in Sam Laporta now as sort of your number 2 to number 3 guy, I guess, in terms of where he is in terms of being a target in this offense. One of the best receiving tight ends in the entire league. Him and George Kittle are very similar. You'd think that Laporta would want to be more of a contested catch guy. Hopefully they can get to that for him. Another guy who doesn't drop the football. 60 catches, 700 yards. It's pretty standard for a receiving tight end, especially one that has like these high-level receivers out there, these 1,000-yard receivers surrounding him. To get close to 750 yards is pretty damn good. Especially because a lot of the time these teams are going to have to crash down on him when he operates in those short to intermediate areas. Like they're sort of drawing it up where you want to draw a lot of attention to him and then throw it over the top. There was a lot of that going on, and then like a lot of the trick plays and everything like that, using him as a decoy. And I think him having no ego to be able to be a decoy on a lot of these plays and being available to be a true receiving weapon does help this offense in ways that you just don't get from a lot of other tight ends. And he's an inline tight end, doesn't really go out in the slot. You see a lot of these top level receiving threats do. So to say that him and George Kittle are relatively equals, it's pretty damn close. And I think Laporta, it'll be interesting to see how John Morton views him and utilizes him throughout this season. Because does he become more of a red zone threat? I would like to see that be the case. I'd like to see them use him more in the red zone, throw out those more contested catches, give him more opportunities in that sense. We'll see how they go about deciding that with him. But there's a lot of potential here. There's just a lot of talent in their top 3 guys. And then on top of that, you get to the running backs, and there are talks about Jahmyr Gibbs going out, playing more of a traditional wide receiver in situations, having David Montgomery on the field at the same time. Both of them are really good receiving threats. And so you don't really lose a whole lot. Obviously, they're a little bit different. I think Gibbs is more like a Christian McCaffrey in the run game, in the pass game, where he can run really good routes and he's got a bit more of a route tree. You can split him out a lot more. David Montgomery is just more of a traditional receiving running back. But, I mean, to come out of the backfield, have those delay routes where, he's smart enough to know when he needs to stay in and block and then can split out, as like an outlet. He's a really sure-handed outlet for Jared Goff. So they just have such a variety of talent. They can do everything with all of these guys. The skill sets are really unique, but also they can do everything for the most part. Jameson Williams can kind of do it all, to a degree. Amon-Ra St. Brown can definitely do it all. Sam Laporta as a tight end can really do it all. And then even the things that maybe Jameson Williams doesn't do great, you have Tim Patrick to come in and do that. Maybe it's Ronnie Bell or Tesla or Leavitt. You have these different guys that can come in and be, just bigger threats, maybe more physical players than Jameson Williams is going to be. But, Amon-Ra St. Brown does it all. Jahmyr Gibbs can split out, play some slot. There's a world right now where you got Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs, and David Montgomery all on the field at the exact same time, or, you got Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Khalif Raymond, Jahmyr Gibbs, all out there with Sam Laporta, and then Jahmyr Gibbs runs motion out and you run an empty set, and now who do you cover? And you got so many different skill sets out there. What are the matchups you're trying to create now on the defense side of the ball? You almost have to kind of just run a zone, and if you run a zone, you're not really blitzing anyone, and Jared Goff has a good enough offensive line where he's going to be able to pick you apart. And one of these guys is going to get open and get open quickly. So it's a magical group to have coming in. And the running back room, the variety that you get out of them is just so unique. And that's why they run as about the 6th best running back room, because you are going to be using Jahmyr Gibbs for a lot more than just his running ability. So David Montgomery will take a lot of carries. But just Jahmyr Gibbs just last year taking over as the number 1 back on the team, about 250 carries. He had 1,400 yards, 16 touchdowns, only 1 fumble, so the ball security was really strong. He really just came out and dominated the way you would want a true number 1 running back to do. And they didn't put a lot of tread on his tires running him in between the tackles 300 times. 245 carries is still quite a bit. But a lot of them were zone carries, so it was a lot easier on him to do that. He was forcing missed tackles. Yards after contact, he had 834, counted for 70 first downs. The guy was just on fire. He stepped up in year 2 in the exact way that they wanted him to, and it really justified the thought process they had the year prior of taking him with the 6th overall pick. And you being like, maybe because the running back isn't so valued in the draft community, man, would he have been worth it. So the fact that they got even more picks for him and then still got him and still get this type of production is unreal. And then to have David Montgomery, who in Chicago did have some injury concerns, did have that injury history. So to be able to not just run him into the ground the way that maybe people were expecting it to be when he first signed here, he still was bordering 200 carries, but 775 yards, 4 yards a carry, 12 touchdowns. It allowed him to utilize himself as more of a beat him up running back, which suits him a lot more. But it also, he was allowed him to become the finisher more so than a setup guy. So for him to come out and Jahmyr Gibbs just sort of run ragged all over them throwing the ball around, and then him coming out and then just punishing these guys in between the tackles, punishing linebackers, because 577 of his 775 yards were after contact. He only forced 39 missed tackles. He only had 5 carries that were 15 plus yards, but he accounted for 50 first downs. So him coming in, being more of a short yardage running back, was the perfect utilization of him throughout this season. And now with the prospect of, kicking Jahmyr Gibbs out into being more of a receiver in some situations, I think it's going to open up a little bit more opportunities for him. But I personally like the idea of him hovering around that, 180 carries in a season. And then you can throw in 20, 25 catches after that. But you don't want him to be more than 210 touches, I think, in a year, because you don't want him to get beat up. I think you've found the perfect mixture of how you can utilize these running backs. And maybe, you give him a little bit more to give Gibbs a little bit less. I think that's fair, especially if you're going to use Gibbs as a receiver a little bit more. It's all very fair, but why risk ruining what you've created here, which is just a fantastically balanced running back room that's going to give you that some weeks is going to be just a dominating force, and then other weeks, depending on what kind of opponent they're getting, David Montgomery will be mostly the running back, and then, you might lose a little bit. You'll bump it down to maybe, 7th-ish in the league. But David Montgomery, as a pure starter, would have a really high grade. You would just be concerned about him being the bell cow back. Now he's on that scenario. They even got some depth guys in there that are kind of fun, like Craig Williams and Sione Vaki, who I could see being mixed in there as well throughout the season, them getting opportunities to being more like receiving threats or whatever. But I think Sione Vaki, being a former defensive player, former linebacker, coming in and being like a punishing back as well, could be a fun little wrinkle they could add to the offense. But just from an overall sense, how do you find a more balanced run game than this? You're not getting the high-end consistency that you got from Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry because, Jahmyr Gibbs as your best back just isn't getting the touches that those guys are going to be getting as a pure running back. But I think that he could do that as well as anybody. It's just not an offense that dictates that. So you're not going to get that type of production from him, even though the production that he gave you last year was among some of the best. He did that because he was able to stay fresh a lot of the time when he was touching the ball. It wasn't because he was particularly, wearing and tearing and worn out and whatnot throughout a season. So you don't want to just get away from what Ben Johnson had in terms of the balance of this run game. You want to maintain what he had in order to truly optimize the talents that you have. So now we're getting to the offensive line, and this is what I was talking about when I talked about the concerns that I have with the offensive line now. You lost Frank Ragnow and you lost Kevin Zeitler, two high-end starters on the interior offensive line, which means now Christian Mahogany and Tate Ratledge get thrust into the starting lineup. Tate Ratledge, a rookie, wasn't all that high on him. Don't really know exactly what to expect from him from the interior right guard position. Graham Glasgow, a veteran, gradual regression, still a decent starter, but, probably better being your worst offensive lineman out there than having to be one of the better ones at this point. And then you have Christian Mahogany, who, developmental last season, gets to come in, hopefully pick up where he left off, at least from a running sense. But they're still 30th in pass blocking because of that, 20th in run blocking, because even from their tackles, especially, Penei Sewell we'll get to, but you have Taylor Decker, who is a solid starting tackle, left tackle still in the league, but definitely just not the superstar that he used to be. He had 489 snaps last year, took 4 penalties, gave up 8 sacks. That's not like Pro Bowl level performance. It's just not. 31 pressures, it's just not a Pro Bowl level performance. Now, he's still starting quality. Maybe he can bounce back. Maybe he can get back, raise the level a little bit here. But everything from him is sort of screaming at this point that it's all downhill from here, which is a huge concern because we just talked about Jared Goff and what it's like for him to be under the pressure that he's under and how that affects his performances. Even from a run, perspective, he's solid. He's solid enough from the left tackle position. It's not really the biggest demand that you have of the left tackle in this offense. They have so many other guys out there where, Taylor Decker is very serviceable in this role, and he fits into what they want to do in the run game. So I'm not overly concerned with that. Still a much better zone blocker than a gap blocker, and they're going to run zone majority of the time anyway. But I am concerned that he would have this, a significant regression, which it's a problem. Because you don't really have the depth here either to sort of make up for it. You got Dan Skipper and Jamarco Jones. Miles Frazier's an interior guy. He could be somebody that could potentially compete for a starting job at some point, but I wouldn't really count on it. Coyote Owasika has had some starting experience, at some points, but, he's not somebody you want on the field regularly. Michael Neese is just a veteran who's, a swing guy. So there's not this depth guy that you have available now. When you lose 2 quality starters, if you lose 2 quality starters, you bring in Tate Ratledge, okay, we got a developmental interior guy. To now thrust a guy, a day 2 pick, into the starting lineup, it does draw some concerns here, especially, you have Penei Sewell, who an elite level run blocker, but from a pass blocking perspective has been shockingly just kind of average. Took 6 penalties, only gave up a sack and 28 pressures, but was doing that a lot from the front side. He's getting a lot of tight end help in that scenario. So it's just a little bit easier in this offense to be the right tackle and pass pro. And he didn't shine the way that you would expect him to. It was very unmagical, if that makes sense. The exact opposite can be said for him about his run blocking. He's as elite as it gets when it comes to run blocking. He might be the best run blocking tackle in the entire league. It's him up there with Lane Johnson, all those guys. But he might be the best one. An A-plus zone blocker running almost 60% zone. Even when they were running gap, he was still as close to an elite gap run blocker as you could find as well. So that's not really the concern. Maybe he can develop more in pass pro as the demands come. I think that there's a scenario where, maybe next year he's the left tackle and Taylor Decker might be gone. If Taylor Decker continues like the downward trajectory of his regression, I think that that's very possible. I think Taylor Decker sort of lives off the reputation of this offensive line. I think now, lacking Zeitler and Frank Ragnow, we're going to see maybe a little bit more of an exposure here of some of these guys. Kevin Zeitler playing next to Penei Sewell, was a huge benefit to Sewell. And it was a huge benefit to Zeitler, but Sewell, from a pass blocking perspective, benefited quite a bit from that communication aspect. Zeitler always being in the right spot, making sure that Sewell was in the right spot. Playing with that veteran presence next to him, that does help, and that can't be understated. Decker had Graham Glasgow next to him and all that, but from the guards' perspective, Graham Glasgow now playing without Frank Ragnow, what does that look like? Because Glasgow sort of had this he sort of raised the floor of his performances having Frank Ragnow next to him, but now he doesn't. So now he's sort of the guy that has to raise up these two young players next to him. Mahogany, a second-year player, Tate Ratledge, a rookie. He's got to navigate that as a center, as the leader of the offensive line now, with these two young talents right next to him, who, for the very likely, could hang him out to dry a couple times this season, which that's not the area of the offensive line you want to hang out to dry, because that's where Jared Goff is going to struggle the most, is with that interior up the middle pressure on him. So there is concern here for me. There's a lot of concern here for me that this offensive line that's been so good for so many years now, that Dan Campbell did a great job building, lost too many key players too quickly and just haven't been able to replace them now fast enough. So there's going to be just a lot of growing pains that are going to slow down the offense and the offense's production this year. Now, overall, that does make them my 14th ranked offense. 8th pass offense, tied for 9th in run game. The offensive line drags them down a bit, and the new offensive coordinator does draw some concerns here. And I feel like the growing pains coming in early in the season with the offensive line, with the play calling, trying to build that chemistry, is going to lower what this team can do, at least early in the season offensively. How they develop and how they come to the chemistry later in the season is still up in the air. I think by the end of the season, hopefully they get back to being like that top 5 offense quality, where John Morton gets into a nice rhythm with the scheme and the strategizing and the play-to-play calling, drive to drive, changing things up enough, understanding situations and what his team is good at. I think that's something that we're going to have to look for John Morton as the season develops, so to improve that overall offensive ranking. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball, and Kelvin Shepard's defense, which has a lot of really bright spots on it, man. It is a fantastic defense in so many ways that you guys are about to see, and it starts with the defensive line. Aidan Hutchinson is the star here, and they're the 17th ranked pass rush, 8th in run defense. Aidan Hutchinson, what he did, I'm going to show you these numbers. Keep in mind, he did this playing only 280 snaps last year. He had 8 sacks, 45 pressures. He was first in pass rush win rate efficiency. It was like 10% higher than second place. It was like 33.4% or something like that for his pass rush win rate. Just an absolutely incredible performance from him. And for it to end the way that it did with the broken leg is just incredibly tragic, because he was like runaway. This might be a record-breaking season, record-breaking performance. And to have that type of lower body injury, to come back with any type of confidence on the field, that's going to be a really rough situation for him. So seeing how he can bounce back from that, I'm just going on the assumption that he's an elite level talent and he's going to bounce back from that. There is a world where he doesn't, and he sort of regresses down a little bit, but from such a high, like his hand placement was great, his feet were amazing. He knew He had counter moves to counter moves to counter moves on all these offensive linemen. His get off was so elite. He was just faster than everyone out there. He was stronger than everyone out there. There wasn't a right tackle in the league that he faced that wasn't outmatched. It was as much of a breakout performance as anyone has ever had. And it's such a shame that we didn't get to see it through. And maybe he can run it back. Maybe he's going to be capable of running it back, because there is some improvements there on the defensive line to a little bit of a degree. There is the idea that, there's a bit more of a rotation there that's going to help him out, a little bit more exoticness. Hopefully, maybe Kelvin Shepherd can scheme something up that's a little bit different, that's going to open up opportunities for him. That's yet to be seen, but even from a run defense perspective, he was phenomenal. He didn't rank in the stops percentage. He had a forced fumble. He only had 6 tackles. He had about a tackle a game, but his job was to get after the quarterback. He was taken 2nd overall to go get the quarterback, and every single year that he's played, he's gotten better and better and better. He has been the epitome of progression from rookie, top-level blue-chip rookie to now this, dare I say, veteran star, superstar, megastar. You're hard-pressed to find a guy who is more balanced than him. We just covered Nick Bosa, incredibly balanced. We've covered TJ Watt recently, incredibly balanced. Aidan Hutchinson falls into that category. Now, what he's got from an edge room opposite him is questionable. It's going to be a revolving door situationally. Marcus Davenport still listed as the starter. I don't get it. I don't get what anyone sees in Davenport from a starting caliber perspective. He's not the best, not the second best edge rusher for me on this team. He's not even like the top 3, edge run defenders on this team. He's living off of like the potential that people saw in him way back when at UTEP, and that New Orleans basically gave up an entire first round's worth of draft picks for 2 years in order to go and get. That never really saw it, never was healthy enough, just didn't become the guy that they were hoping. He's got Al-Quadin Muhammad, who's going to be competing with him. He's got Josh Paschal, who's going to be competing with him. They drafted Ahmed Hassanin to compete with him. There's talk of Zadarius Smith coming in as well. He hasn't signed there as of yet, but there's talk of him coming back. All that is going to just take away from Marcus Davenport. So there is really a world, I would think, logically, where Marcus Davenport doesn't even make this team. Especially if they bring in Zadarius Smith. That kind of brings in a guy who's going to be a pass rusher, and then they just need guys who can defend the run, and that's just not Marcus Davenport's forte. That's much more Josh Pascal's forte. That's much more Ahmed Hassanin's forte. So that's a situation where I think Davenport could be gone. If they don't bring in Zadarius Smith, though, I think they keep Davenport because they feel like his upside potential as a pass rusher is just too high to give up. From the interior defensive line, they did a great job of building the depth here, even with losing Levi Onwuzurike for the season, which I believe that they have. They brought in Roy Lopez. They drafted Tyleik Williams, who I wasn't that high on as a pass rusher, but I think from just a pure run defender standpoint, he can come in on early downs and be really, really serviceable as he develops as a pass rusher. I think he's also not in direct competition with any of these guys. I think Roy Lopez and DJ Reader are more in direct competition with each other, which is why we'll probably see DJ Reader more on early downs, and then Roy Lopez, might sub in as well as being his backup in his spell, and maybe DJ Reader doesn't get a lot of snaps. But then you have a Lee McNeil who's just, across the board really great. Kind of was, down a bit in certain areas of his production, but he was 6th in pass rush win rate amongst interior defensive linemen last year with 4 sacks, 45 pressures, 382 snaps from the B gap. He almost took 200 snaps from a 4-eye tech, which was kind of astonishing for me. I didn't necessarily expect to see that come up in looking at his snap counts and his alignments. I expected a lot more A-gap snaps, so maybe that changes this year, but maybe with Roy Lopez and DJ Reader and Tyleik Williams, it sort of sits at this level of 382 B-gap snaps and then 4 I snaps. And then those guys eat up a lot more A-gap snaps throughout the season. Because even from a run stuffing perspective, he was 58th in stops, but 18 tackles. His job was to be a space eater in running situations, open up opportunities for the linebackers. And I think that's why you have a Lee McNeil and you have DJ Reader. You have these very large humans who are just going to suck up double teams on the interior, because it leaves everyone else sort of on an island. It opens up a lot of opportunities for your linebackers to just have free runs at the running back in the gap. All they got to do is make sure they pick the right gap, and they get free runs at these running backs. So he opens up a lot of opportunities, a huge, huge player in that sense. And I think that with a healthy season and the good rotation they're going to be giving him now, it's a 4-man defensive line rotation now. The fresh legs he's going to have, I think, is going to really benefit his overall performance, his overall output. And I think the same can go for DJ Reader as well. I do wonder about what they do, because Levi Onwuzurike was going to eat up a lot of snaps. How do those snaps get distributed between, the two main starters, McNeil and Reader, but then Roy Lopez and Tyleik Williams? Logic tells you it's going to be Tyleik Williams being a first-round pick and everything like that, that he's going to be the one that comes in and gets a majority of the snaps, but you lose a lot in pass rush when you do that. Levi Onwuzurike was a great interior defensive lineman for pass rush. Roy Lopez is very good. By my estimation, the second best next to Lee McNeil for your interior defensive line. So are you running the risk of losing that? Or is Tyleik Williams going to be somebody you just utilize very situationally throughout the season and allow him to develop? I think that's more so the path that they will take, because I think from a run stuffing perspective, he's right up there. So you can run a traditional base 3-4 defense with them, where you have Williams, McNeil, and Reader there on the interior with Hutchinson and then Pascal. And you got a really big set there, because Pascal can even operate as like a 3-4 defensive end type. He was sort of drafted to be like this weird hybrid anyway. And that just opens up opportunities for your linebackers. So I think when you want to play big, if you end up against these offenses that want to play big on the offensive side of the ball, that you're going to be able to match up incredibly well against them. I think teams that are going to be more, spread it out, play fast, is where you're going to see this defensive line struggle against that type of an offense, because they just don't have the bodies from a pass rushing perspective off the edge that's going to be able to counteract that, other than Aidan Hutchinson. Hutchinson's going to make a ton of plays and very much keep the pass rush probably one of the better ones statistically in the whole league. But just from a balance perspective, if you're able to figure out a way to shut down Aidan Hutchinson in a game, then you've pretty much shut down the entire edge rush of this entire defense. So there is that sort of counteracting here, which is why I feel like getting Zadarius Smith and sort of dumping Marcus Davenport would be the best option for this defense. I think it would improve you immensely. It would probably take your pass rush into the top 12, take your run defense up a little bit as well into like top, being maybe 7th or 6th in the league instead. So, but overall, it's a group that, Kelvin Shepherd's going to be really able to dive into, especially now that you're getting a healthy Aidan Hutchinson back. Now, this is the group that got Kelvin Shepherd the defensive coordinator job. The the hired linebackers coach, they have the best linebacking group in the entire league in both aspects. In pass coverage and in run defense, they are the best, because they have 3 legit starters in this group, in Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, and Malcolm Rodriguez, and they have even Derek Barnes, who from an early down run stuffing perspective can come in, play a number of different positions in the linebacking group. He can play an outside linebacker role. He can play like a 3-4 outside linebacker role in run situations if you want to go that route. There's just a lot of variety that you can have here, and it's all starting quality guys. Malcolm Rodriguez, tremendous in run defense. He's going to be like that short yardage linebacker that comes in. And then Anzalone in the more traditional passing sets will be out there as well. And I think being able to play both these two linebackers at a time allows you to counteract when a team might want to run a drop play or they see like a smaller set and they want to convert to a run, or the opposite. They see two linebackers want to convert to a pass. Having Campbell, Anzalone, and even Malcolm Rodriguez, who's number 2 quality, but you have 2 number 1 quality coverage linebackers here. We'll start this out with Jack Campbell. 78 tackles. He was 7th in stops percentage. He did give up 101.5 passer rating, but he didn't give up any touchdowns. He broke up 3 passes, kept everything in front of him, played a really solid zone. Was targeted almost 50 times, gave up less than 40 catches. So, these are decent linebacker coverage numbers for him. It's quality. Force everything to the outside. Teams are going to want to stay away from him. He's also the type of linebacker that's going to fly all over the field. So, he's just a really, really good linebacker. He developed really well. Kelvin Sheppard did a great job with him, developing him into, being a quality guy. He was a first-round pick that everyone viewed as kind of a reach at the time when they took him. So for him to turn into what he's turned into here speaks volumes of Kelvin Sheppard's quality of being at least a positional coach. So how he converts that to being a defense coordinator, you're hoping he can spread that out amongst everyone, because even Alex Anzalone, who I think people viewed as, being potential that was unrealized, especially his time in New Orleans. And then he came here to Detroit and got maybe a little bit more playing time than people thought he should have. But from a coverage perspective last year, he was just on top of his game. He did give up 40 catches on 53 targets, but only gave up 350 yards, had 4 pass breakups, and a less than a 100 passer rating when targeted, which is just great numbers for a linebacker. He was also a pretty sure tackler, 8.5% missed tackle rate, which you like to see that improve, but from a run defense perspective, he's just not that kind of a guy. He's not that kind of a player. He's a number 2 linebacker in that sense, in every sense of the word. And his ability to settle in as the team's number 2 linebacker at this point in his career, it's just great. And you're going to be able to utilize him advantageously. They're having this type of depth at the linebacker group where you can put the younger guy, Malcolm Rodriguez, and you're not really losing a lot. You're getting a number 2 quality pass coverage guy. You're getting a number 1 quality run defender. So you're able to elevate this entire defense, and this is going to help out that defensive line where, as long as the defensive line, particularly from the interior, got the younger guys like Tyleik Williams, for example, as long as they stay very gap disciplined, there's no reason why this linebacker group won't have a repeat of what they did last year, which is just some of the best quality linebacker play in the entire NFL. It's a really exciting group to see, and it's the reason Kelvin Sheppard got the defensive coordinator job. So we'll see if this group now, with Kelvin Sheppard not so focused on it, can repeat what they did, and if this is indicative of the type of development that we're going to get from other position groups and other players on this defense now that Kelvin Sheppard's been elevated to the defensive coordinator position. This is really the heart and soul of what this defense is and what this defense is going to need to be this year. And they got just fantastic play here. Even Zach Cunningham, who's linebacker 5 for me, just he's as good as some of the guys that are starting on some teams. So it's a lot of depth. They're going to be able to roll out a really healthy rotation here. Jack Campbell will be the star, the green dot guy, and we'll see what the other 3 are going to be able to produce. But I'm expecting greatness from this group. Defensive backs. This is the best defensive backs group against the run. They play such physical football. They are aggressive at the point of attack. They make smart decisions. They have the ability to play multiple different positions in a drive at a time, make guys guess, and they're even top 10 in coverage at this point for me. They do fall into a bit of an issue where I am worried about the outside corners. I think down the middle of the field, going back to the linebackers there, they got it. They are great up the middle. You're not going to be able to throw that ball over the middle against this team. You're going to have to pick on them on the outsides. And that's where you bring in DJ Reed in free agency to come in and basically be your number one corner on the outside, at least at the start of the year. He only allowed 2 touchdowns last year, had 7 pass breakups, did give up a 92 passer rating almost. So from where he would rank preferably, he'd be your number 2 corner. So there is going to be a little bit of pressure on him. 35 catches on 60 targets. It's a pretty good number. He did take 11 penalties, though. Now, that's a giant concern, taking the 11 penalties. So he's getting beat, and he's bailing himself out from the statistical embarrassment. So apply those 11 penalties to those 25 unrealized catches on his targets, and it does change the context quite a bit here with him, which is why it does bump him down to number 2 and why that passer rating is as high as it is against him. Didn't have a lot of interceptions at all. That's not his game. So how he settles in here as being the team's now number 1 corner as compared to number 2 corner opposite of one of the best in the entire league the last couple of years in Ahmad Gardner. Much better in zone. How he matches up in man. We'll see what kind of man coverage they roll out. But it makes you worry about what they got going on there on the outside, on that side. And then opposite of him, you have Terrion Arnold, who, is a bit of a project at this point. You're going to need him to step up in huge ways. We'll say that. He's going to get the starting reps on the outside because you have Amik Robinson, you have Avonte Maddox, who are going to be competing amongst each other for more of that nickelback role, I feel, more of that slot corner role. And I think Amik Robertson has the inside lane on that because he is a much more physical player than Maddox. He's a little bit younger. He's got a little bit more length to him. But the pressure on Terrion Arnold to up his physicality on the outside, be a little bit smarter in zone coverage, be a little stickier in man coverage, not too sticky where you're taking penalties and all that. His development is really the key here to how well they're going to perform from an outside corner perspective, because you want, with these safeties, to be able to play more like a cover 3 with a single high safety and the other guy sort of hovering around, because you start with Kirby Joseph, who had the best season of his career up to this point, had 9 interceptions, only gave up a 72.2 passer rating, played a majority of his snaps as, a traditional safety, but, was up at the line in the slot and in the box, quite a bit as well. Only took 1 penalty, which from how aggressive he plays out there was a little bit of a shock, I would say. I expected maybe a little bit more penalties from him for some reason. But he, 16 catches on 27 targets, 231 yards. That's pretty damn good. Only gave up 2 touchdowns. 71 tackles. So the ability to roll him, down into the box and have him execute really well in the run defense, for him to be able to play that deep coverage and be, last year he was probably the best coverage safety in the league. Having 9 interceptions, 72 passer rating against you, that's as elite as it comes. So to be able to build upon that, this is what I was talking about when, you shift from a cornerback, defensive back friendly defensive coordinator to now a different position group as the focus point, is the experience level of the coordinator. Does that lead to a regression? But again, he's such a high level that even if he regressed a little bit, you're still getting an elite level safety play. And then you turn to Brian Branch, who's sort of like this mirror image of what you have in Kirby Joseph. He got targeted a lot more. He had 11 pass breakups, a 72 passer rating when targeted. He took 9 penalties, which, him coming up and playing in the slot a lot more and being more of a box safety more often, kind of lends to that. You get, illegal contact penalties and whatnot a little bit more often. So you want to dial those penalties down. But when he wasn't getting the penalties, he was playing elite level football. So it's hard to deny him that. And again, being able to play him and Kirby Joseph all over the back end of that secondary and allowing offenses to not be able to predict what each guy is going to be doing at any given time, that's a huge advantage. and they execute it really well. And I think Brian Branch being able to play a more traditional safety is probably what's best for him, but I think him also being sort of this Kyle Hamilton-esque player lends to helping out the entire defensive back group more as a whole, if that makes sense, because it allows guys who are maybe a little bit more specialized to remain in that specialty, like Amik Robertson or Avonte Maddox, for example. You know, you want Kirby Joseph to maybe play a little bit deeper down the field because he's got probably more sideline to sideline instincts than Branch. I think Branch operates a lot more instinctually and a lot better than Joseph in the short to intermediate areas, which is why you'll see him play slot and play the box safety more often. I think there is a level of concern with me when it comes to the depth, though, of the defensive back room. I think Ennis Rakestraw being out, it kind of did diminish what could have existed here. You know, it's amazing what one player's injury can do, but there was a lot of developmental potential with Rakestraw this year that I think people were expecting that now isn't going to be there, so that's going to have to wait a year, which puts a lot more pressure on Terrion Arnold and Amik Robertson and Avonte Maddox to get to a higher level. And you're hoping that the front end, the front four, can get a good pass rush in here. That does open up more opportunities for these more aggressive defensive backs that they have in Arnold and DJ Reed. They're just more aggressive players, so you hope that they can build on that by allowing them to play that way with a good front four presence in the pass rush. But, I mean, I look at Khalil Dorsey, Rocky Sin, sort of like a corner safety hybrid at this point. You know, Morris Norris, you know, got that big time injury. He's probably not going to play this year. They have two rookies in there, Russell and Kennelly, but like, what are they going to be? So it's just tough to project. So you hope that you can get a healthy year and that you're hoping for the development of the guys you're thrusting into the starting lineup to sort of see its potential finally, especially Terrion Arnold, who has struggled. But overall, they come in as my 9th ranked defense, 6th pass defense, and the best run defense in the league. That comes from the linebackers, that comes from the front four especially, and then having that back end support just takes them to that next level. Again, it's the defensive coordinator that kind of puts them in a weird spot where it's hard to project, you know, what kind of chemistry they're going to have, what kind of strategy they're going to have week to week and game to game and drive to drive that's going to allow the talent to play at the level that we're expecting them to from an individual talent perspective. They did draw a pretty tough schedule, the 3rd hardest schedule in the league. But they did draw a pretty decent hand here. You know, they get Pittsburgh at home, they get Dallas at home, they get the Giants at home, they get Green Bay, you know, of course, twice. They get Chicago twice, which I think is good for them. You know, Minnesota twice, so they get the home game against Minnesota. They get Tampa at home. You know, they get Cincinnati. They get Cincinnati on the road. But, you know, the only game that I'm really just looking at going, they're going to be completely outmatched probably, is going on the road to Baltimore early in the year. While you're still probably going to have some growing pains with the play calling on the offense and defense side of the ball, you're still going to have probably some growing pains on the offensive line. You're probably going to still have some growing pains at the outside corner position as they develop and they get comfortable out there. So it's just a rough time to draw the Baltimore Ravens at that point. You know, getting Kansas City that early is kind of a bummer too. You did get Philadelphia and Washington on the road as well, which kind of sucks. You know, you almost prefer to maybe get Philly and Washington at home and then the Giants and Dallas on the road. You know, but it's just a tough draw for them in that sense. But I do expect them to hit the over. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 9 games here where I'm like, they're going to win these games for sure. And then enough push games in there where 11, 12 wins should be what Detroit gets. I think especially once they get into a rhythm again with the play calling and the strategy, you know, from each coordinator and that chemistry builds up and Dan Campbell sort of helps navigate them in the right direction. I think that's where you're really going to see some improvements and then get back on track. So overall, they are the 8th ranked team in the league coming in here. 6th head coach, 14th offense, 9th defense. You know, it's really offensive line, particularly the interior of the offensive line. What they got going on is a secondary edge rusher opposite Aidan Hutchinson, and what they got going on at outside corner from positional group standpoint, and then just the coordinators, like I've been saying. That's the only thing. Those are the things that would be holding them back from being champions this year. There it is, my number 8 team, the Detroit Lions. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up, and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I like to see your thoughts, and I really appreciate you guys coming. Really appreciate you guys being here. We're almost towards the end. We're almost at number 1. Now, predict who you think number 1 is in the comment section, I guess. We only got a couple of these left, so let me see what you guys think, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye.